Lieutenant Adrienne Calix never thought it would end like this. She had fought in countless battles, led missions with precision, and survived the harshest conditions. But now, lying in the wreckage of her ship, she felt more vulnerable than ever before. Her legs were useless, crushed under the twisted metal of the cockpit. The pain was sharp, overwhelming, but the worst part was the silence that followed. The chaos of the battle had faded, and all she could hear was the steady hiss of oxygen from her suit. Her comm link crackled to life, the voice on the other end strained and distant. "Lieutenant Calix, are you there?" Adrienne's vision blurred, but she managed to press a button on her wrist, activating the comm. "I'm here. I need help. Now." There was a pause, too long of one. She could feel the weight of the situation settling in, as if the air itself had grown heavier. The voice returned, now with a colder edge. "We've lost too many. The Kraith are closing in. We can't risk sending anyone back for you. You need to make your way to the rendezvous point." Adrienne's breath caught in her throat. "I can't. My legs. I can't move." There was a long, uncomfortable silence before the voice spoke again, this time with no compassion. "It's a war, Lieutenant. We can't afford to save everyone." Before Adrienne could respond, the comm link cut out, leaving her alone in the wreckage, staring up at the sky as the sounds of the battle outside faded into nothing. Her heart raced. She knew what that meant. They were leaving her behind. The days that followed felt like an endless blur of pain and confusion. The Kraith, an alien species unlike anything humanity had ever encountered, had already begun their assault on the planet, and Adrienne had been caught in the middle. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She was just a casualty, discarded by the very people she had once fought beside. Hours passed, maybe even days. She couldn't tell. Every time she tried to move, the sharp pain in her lower body stopped her. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself. She was stranded in hostile territory, vulnerable and alone. But she wasn't entirely without hope. A voice, a presence, remained beside her. Theo Rain, a young mechanic and soldier from her squadron, had stayed behind. He hadn't hesitated when others had written her off. He had stayed, despite the danger, despite the orders. He had made a promise, one that he intended to keep. Adrienne's mind flickered back to when they first met. She had been a rising star in the fleet, sharp, intelligent, and always in command. Theo had been a quiet presence, a bit awkward at times, always working on engines and tech, never seeking attention. But he had a way with machines, and in the field, that was a valuable skill. Over the years, they had become unlikely friends. Where Adrienne was strong and decisive, Theo was thoughtful and meticulous. They balanced each other out. Now he was all she had left. Adrienne's eyes fluttered open, the pain in her body unbearable, but she forced herself to focus. The sound of rustling echoed from behind her, followed by a familiar voice. "I'm here, Lieutenant." She turned her head as much as she could, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. Theo appeared from the shadows, looking exhausted but determined. His hands were covered in dirt and oil, and his uniform was torn, but his eyes held a spark of resolve that made Adrienne's chest tighten. He hadn't given up on her, even when everyone else had. Theo crouched down beside her, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not going to leave you. I'll get you out of here." Adrienne's throat tightened as she looked up at him. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She could barely keep her eyes open, but his presence, steady, unwavering, was enough to give her a shred of hope. He set to work immediately, his hands moving with purpose. She couldn't understand what he was doing at first, but she didn't need to. She had always trusted Theo. If anyone could figure out how to survive this, it was him. Hours passed. Adrienne wasn't sure how many. Theo worked tirelessly, gathering supplies, setting up a makeshift camp, and trying to patch up her wounds as best he could. Every time she drifted in and out of consciousness, he was there, watching over her, keeping the darkness at bay. He was more than just a soldier. He was her lifeline. Eventually, Theo stopped for a moment, looking at her with a quiet intensity. I know you don't want to hear this, but we need to move. The Karaith will find us soon if we don't get out of here. I've got a plan. Adrienne blinked, her head spinning. The pain in her legs made her nauseous, but Theo's words cut through the fog. Plan, she croaked. His lips curled into a small, determined smile. I found a ship. We can make it there if we're careful. Just trust me, okay? She nodded weakly, feeling an odd sense of calm in his presence. She didn't have the strength to argue or question him. She didn't even have the energy to move on her own. All she could do was trust that Theo would get them out of this. Because if anyone could survive this nightmare, it was the two of them. Adrienne woke up to the sound of distant explosions, the vibrations in the ground shaking her entire body. It was a constant reminder that the war wasn't over, and the Karaith weren't far away. Her head throbbed, and the pain in her legs was almost unbearable, but she forced herself to focus. She had to. Theo had found a small cave in the hills not far from the crash site, a place where they could hide for a while. It wasn't much, just a few rocks piled together for shelter, but it was enough to keep them out of sight from the Karaith patrols. Adrienne's eyes scanned the cave as she shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. She could feel the weight of the situation settling on her. She was stuck here, with no way to move, no way to fight. But then she saw Theo, hunched over a makeshift workbench, surrounded by tools and pieces of alien tech. His hands were steady, moving quickly as he patched up a broken communication device he had scavenged earlier. He looked up when he noticed her staring. "You're awake," he said, his voice calm but tired. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been run over by a truck," Adrienne replied weakly, her throat dry. She tried to sit up but winced when the pain in her legs shot through her body. Theo was by her side in an instant, gently helping her adjust. "You're lucky I'm not a doctor," he said with a small smile. "But I'm doing the best I can." Adrienne managed a tired grin. "You've always been good with your hands." Theo's smile faded a little as he checked the wound on her leg. The pain was still sharp, but Adrienne was starting to notice the care in his touch, the way he handled her as if she were fragile. She had always been tough, always the one in control, but now she was completely dependent on him. The thought made her uncomfortable, but she didn't have much choice. Theo handed her a canteen of water. "Here, drink. You're dehydrated." Adrienne took the water gratefully, her hands shaking as she brought it to her lips. "What's the plan?" she asked after a long sip. Theo set down the tools he'd been using and sat beside her. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his brow furrowed in thought. "We need to get out of here. The Karaith will search for us eventually, and if we stay in one place too long, they'll find us. We have to move. I've been working on a way to get you out of here, but it's not going to be easy." Adrienne's heart sank. She hated hearing that. She hated feeling like a burden, hated feeling helpless. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I've been working on modifying a few pieces of alien tech," Theo explained, his voice steady. "I know we're not exactly in the best position to build anything right now, but I'm trying to put something together that'll help you move. The Karaith are good at making things that are difficult for us to handle, but I'm hoping we can turn their tech against them." Adrienne blinked, confused. "You mean you're going to build something?" Theo nodded. "Exactly. I'm hoping to build something that'll help you get around, something that'll let you move without relying on your legs." He paused for a moment, his expression darkening. "It's going to be dangerous. You'll need to fight, but I'll be right there with you." Adrienne swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. She had never felt so vulnerable, so powerless. All her life, she had been trained to lead, to fight, to be strong. But now she was lying in a cave, waiting for Theo to save her. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly, more to herself than to Theo. Theo didn't respond at first, but then he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not a burden. You're my friend." We're in this together, and I'm not leaving you behind. I don't care what anyone says. Adrienne felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't used to being taken care of, but in that moment, she realized how much it meant to have someone by her side. Theo wasn't just a soldier following orders. He was a friend, someone who cared about her, someone who was willing to risk everything to help her. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say anything more. Theo smiled, his eyes warm. "No need to thank me. We're going to get through this. You'll see." The next few days passed in a blur of work, exhaustion, and quiet conversations. Theo worked day and night on the tech he had scavenged, using every bit of knowledge and skill he had to build something that could help Adrienne. Meanwhile, Adrienne did her best to help, though she could do little more than offer advice and moral support. She watched Theo as he worked, marveling at his patience and determination. He was so focused, so driven, that it was hard to imagine he had any doubts. But every time Adrienne caught his eye, she could see the weight of the situation on him. He was pushing himself to the limit, and it was clear he wasn't doing it for himself. He was doing it for her. And that, more than anything, kept Adrienne going. She might not have her legs anymore, but she still had her mind. And as long as she had Theo by her side, she knew she wouldn't give up. The days bowled into each other, each one almost identical to the last. Adrienne could feel the frustration building in Theo, even though he did his best to hide it. Every time he worked on the alien tech, there was a tension in the air, as if he was pushing himself too hard, too fast. Adrienne understood. He was trying to fix something that wasn't meant to be fixed. He was trying to save her, but she couldn't let him do it all alone. Adrienne rolled over on the cold stone floor of their hiding place and winced as the sharp pain in her legs flared up again. She couldn't help it. Every movement reminded her that her body was no longer the same. Her mind still worked, still strategized, still planned, but her body had failed her. That thought, that harsh reality, still stung, but she wasn't going to give up. She watched as Theo adjusted some wiring, muttering to himself as he soldered the pieces together. He was trying to modify an alien exosuit he'd scavenged from a downed Kraith ship. Adrienne wasn't sure how he was doing it, but she knew it was complicated. The tech wasn't made for humans. No, it was made for something stronger, something more capable than her in her current state. But Theo wouldn't be deterred. She had to help him. She had to do something. "Hey, Theo," she called softly, her voice hoarse from the dry air in the cave. She didn't want to interrupt his concentration, but he paused and looked at her. "What's up?" he asked, his voice a little tired but patient. "I want to try something," Adrienne said, sitting up slowly. The pain in her legs was unbearable, but she forced herself to ignore it. "Let me help you. I know how to read the schematics. I can help you understand how it works. Two heads are better than one, right?" Theo's face softened with a smile. "I don't want you to push yourself. You've been through a lot already." "I've been through worse," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We're in this together, Theo. You've been working day and night on this. Let me help." Theo stared at her for a moment, and Adrienne could see the conflict in his eyes. He didn't want to see her in pain. He didn't want to risk her worsening her condition. But after a long pause, he nodded. "All right. But if it hurts, you stop. No arguments. Deal." Adrienne shifted her position carefully, trying not to aggravate her injuries. She leaned over, her fingers lightly grazing the alien tech Theo had been working on. It was a strange mix of metals, materials that felt colder than anything she had ever worked with. And the wires were thinner than human wiring, delicate, almost fragile. Theo handed her a small tool, a device she didn't recognize. But she trusted him. She took it, feeling the weight of it in her hand. "What do I need to do?" "Just follow the pattern I started," he said, pointing to a series of wires and connections he had set up. "I've been trying to link it to your neural system, but I'm not sure if the wiring is compatible with your biology. It's all guesswork at this point." Adrienne nodded. She didn't care. She was determined to make it work. As she worked, a strange sense of peace settled over her. It was familiar. She had always been good with tech. Back before the crash, she had spent hours on ships, tinkering with engines, learning the ins and outs of machines. This wasn't much different, except the stakes were much higher. Theo watched her closely, his eyes filled with a mix of admiration and concern. She focused on the task, ignoring the pain that crept up her legs. It felt like her old self again, like she was contributing, like she was still capable of something. The thought filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in days. Hours passed. The cave grew darker, and the sound of the outside world became distant. But Adrienne didn't stop. Her hands moved methodically, connecting wires, adjusting circuits. It was slow going, but with each small success, her confidence grew. She could feel the mech suit starting to respond. "We're getting somewhere," Adrienne murmured, adjusting a final piece of wiring. She felt a flicker of hope in her chest, something she hadn't felt since the crash. Theo crouched next to her, his voice a low murmur. "I didn't think you'd be able to do it. This tech it's not human. It's not even close." Adrienne smiled faintly. "I've always liked a challenge." Finally, after what felt like forever, Theo's hand hovered over a panel. "Okay, this is the test," he said, his voice tense with anticipation. He hit a switch. The mech's lights flickered on. Adrienne's heart raced. She could feel the vibrations in her fingertips as the machine hummed to life. It was small, but it was working. The neural link was active. Slowly, carefully, she reached forward to touch the controls. They responded. The mech was adapting to her. For the first time since the crash, Adrienne felt a surge of hope. She wasn't helpless anymore. She wasn't alone in this. "You did it," Theo said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Adrienne's eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of everything, the crash, the isolation, the fear, faded away. "No," she said with a soft smile. "We did it." Theo returned her smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "Now we just need to get out of here." Adrienne nodded. "And we will. Together." Adrienne sat up straight in the makeshift exosuit, her hands gripping the controls as the machine hummed to life. It felt strange at first, foreign even, but the suit's responsiveness was beyond anything she could have imagined. It didn't just move, it seemed to anticipate her thoughts. Each press of a button, every slight shift of her body, made the suit respond with precision. She took a cautious step forward, her body rising from the ground, supported by the suit's mechanical limbs. Her legs, no longer needed in this moment, hung limply inside the suit's reinforced frame. But for the first time in days, Adrienne felt like she was standing tall again. "You did it, Theo," she said, her voice filled with awe. Theo, who had been watching her every move with a mix of admiration and worry, gave her a tired but proud smile. "I didn't do it alone. You're the one who figured out the wiring." Adrienne chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I don't think I could have done it without you." Theo's smile faded a little. "We're in this together. No one's getting left behind." The weight of his words settled on her like a comforting blanket. Adrienne had never been one to rely on others, but now, in this moment, it was different. She could trust Theo. She had to. They hadn't heard any movement outside the cave for a while, but neither of them could afford to be careless. The Karaith would still be searching for them. They had to keep moving. Adrienne carefully made her way to the cave's exit, the suit's limbs moving with ease. It was far from perfect. Her legs still ached from the injury, and the suit wasn't designed for comfort. But it worked. She was walking again. Theo was quick to follow, packing up the rest of their gear. "I've been able to triangulate a path to the nearby hills," he said, his voice low and focused. "If we move fast, we should be able to make it to the abandoned base. It's not far." Adrienne nodded, her mind already calculating the best route. "Let's move then. The longer we stay here, the higher the chance of getting spotted. They both stepped into the open, their eyes scanning the horizon. The planet's harsh terrain stretched out before them. Dusty plains, rocky hills, and jagged cliffs. The wind was dry, carrying with it the scent of burning metal from the distant battlefield. The sky was a pale orange, as if the planet itself was in mourning. The Kraith might have left, but Adrienne knew they wouldn't stay gone forever. As they made their way across the rugged landscape, Adrienne couldn't help but feel the weight of every step. The suit gave her movement, but it didn't replace the strength she had lost. The exosuit's power core hummed, keeping her steady, but the pain in her legs was a constant reminder of her broken body. She clenched her jaw and pushed through it. She didn't have the luxury of weakness. Theo kept pace beside her, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. Adrienne nodded, though she knew it was a lie. "Just keep moving. We can't stop now." Theo didn't push her further. He knew better than to argue when she was focused. They moved silently for what felt like hours, the only sounds being the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the occasional distant rumble of explosions from the ongoing war. Adrienne's eyes never left the horizon, her senses on high alert. Every rustle in the wind, every shift in the terrain had her thinking the worst. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they'd reached the edge of the hills. Adrienne's eyes scanned the area ahead. There, barely visible in the fading light, stood the abandoned military base. It was old, weathered by time, and overgrown with weeds and vines, but it was their best chance of shelter. "That's it," Theo said, his voice tinged with relief. "We're almost there." But Adrienne's instincts kicked in. She stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to signal Theo to halt. "Wait." Theo froze, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" "I think we're being followed," she said, her voice sharp. Theo scanned the area, his hand moving instinctively to the weapon at his side. "Are you sure?" Adrienne nodded. "I don't know how many, but we're not alone. Stay low." They both crouched behind a large rock, their breath steady but their hearts racing. Adrienne's eyes scanned the terrain again, looking for any sign of movement. The Kraith patrols had grown more unpredictable as the war raged on. Sometimes they would move in groups, sometimes alone, hunting down survivors for sport or capture. Theo reached into his bag and pulled out a small drone, a piece of tech they'd scavenged during their journey. He activated it quietly, watching as it hovered in the air, sending back live footage of the area. Adrienne's heart raced as she watched the drone's feed on the small display Theo had set up. There, moving slowly through the rocky hills, were two Kraith soldiers. They were looking in their direction, but they hadn't spotted them yet. "They're close," Theo whispered, his voice tense. Adrienne's mind raced. They couldn't take on the Kraith head-on, not with just the two of them and limited resources. "We need to find cover," she said, her voice low but steady. "Get to the base as quietly as possible. They won't stop searching for us." Theo nodded. "Right. We stick to the shadows. Move fast. Stay quiet." Adrienne felt the familiar surge of adrenaline kick in. She had been in worse situations before. Much worse. And somehow she had always found a way out. She wasn't going to let the Kraith take her down now. Together, they made their move, creeping toward the abandoned base with every step calculated, every sound measured. The Kraith were close, but Adrienne knew they could make it. They just had to be smarter than their enemies. Adrienne and Theo moved through the shadows, their footsteps barely making a sound on the rocky ground. Every step was calculated, every breath held in quiet anticipation. The Kraith soldiers were still a distance away, but Adrienne could hear the faint rustling of their movements. They were close. Too close. "We have to hurry," Theo whispered, his eyes darting between the soldiers and the abandoned base in the distance. Adrienne nodded, her grip tightening on the exosuit's controls. The suit felt heavier now, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on her. Every noise seemed magnified, Every movement felt too loud. They couldn't afford to be seen. "Stay low," she mouthed, signaling Theo to crouch even lower. They were almost there. Just a few more steps to the cover of the overgrown base. Adrian could make out the outlines of old buildings ahead, the faded signs of military life long abandoned. It was their only chance for shelter, if they could make it there without being detected. The Kraith soldiers were still moving toward their position, seemingly unaware of their presence. Adrian's heart raced, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She could almost taste the fear in the air, but she forced herself to focus. They had trained for moments like this. They had been through worse. A sudden gust of wind swept across the barren landscape, sending dust swirling in the air. Adrian froze, instinctively holding her breath. The Kraith soldiers stopped in their tracks, their heads turning toward the source of the sound. Adrian's pulse quickened. She had been sure they hadn't been spotted, but now it seemed the Kraith were suspicious. She glanced at Theo. His face was tense, his fingers twitching toward his weapon. "They're looking this way," Adrian whispered. Theo nodded. "We need to move now. There's no time to waste." Without another word, they both sprinted toward the abandoned base, ducking behind the crumbling walls of the first building they could find. The exosuit's mechanical legs carried Adrienne with surprising speed, the suit's power allowing her to move faster than she ever could have on her own. Theo kept pace beside her, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Once they were safely inside the building's shadow, Adrienne pressed herself against the wall, breathing heavily. Her mind raced, trying to figure out the next step. They were inside the base now, but the danger wasn't over. The Kraith could still be close. "We need to find somewhere to hide," Theo said, his voice low and urgent. Adrian nodded. "I agree. We don't have much time before they come looking." The interior of the building was dark, the only light coming from cracks in the walls where the setting sun filtered through. It looked abandoned. Dust-covered tables, overturned chairs, and faded maps pinned to the walls. No sign of life. It seemed like the Kraith hadn't used the base in years, but that didn't mean it was safe. The Kraith were unpredictable, and if they were searching for survivors, they would check everywhere. "There has to be a secure room somewhere," Adrian said, her voice a whisper. "Somewhere they wouldn't think to look." Theo nodded, scanning the room. "I'll check the vac. You stay here." Adrian didn't argue. She watched as Theo disappeared into the shadows, moving silently through the building. Her heart beat faster as she heard the sound of his footsteps fade. She was alone for the moment, but she couldn't afford to relax. She had to stay alert. The silence was oppressive, every creak of the building sounding like a warning. Adrian's thoughts kept drifting back to the Kraith soldiers. How close were they? Would they find them? She had been in situations like this before, but it had never felt this personal. This wasn't just about survival. This was about protecting each other. She couldn't let Theo down. She couldn't let herself down. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Adrian's fingers twitched at the controls of the exosuit. She could feel the weight of it all. Her injury, the Kraith, the uncertainty of their situation. It was a lot for anyone to handle, but she had to keep it together. For Theo, for herself. Finally, she heard footsteps again. This time, they were coming from the far end of the building. Adrian stiffened, her body freezing in place. The Kraith soldiers must have entered the base. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard their heavy boots moving closer. She glanced around. There was nowhere to hide. No time to find a better place. The Kraith were getting closer, their voices now audible as they spoke in their strange language. Adrian's heart raced. They couldn't be caught here. If the soldiers found them, they wouldn't have a chance. Then, in a flash of movement, Theo returned to her side, his expression grim. "They're inside. We need to find cover. Fast." Adrian nodded, her mind working quickly. "There." She pointed to a small, half-open storage closet at the back of the room. "We can hide there." Theo didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, their bodies crouching low as they reached the storage closet. Adrienne's breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the Wraith soldiers now, moving through the hallways, their voices louder, closer. They slid into the closet, the door barely closing behind them. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Adrienne forced herself to stay quiet, her body pressed against the wall, as she listened to the Wraith soldiers search the building. The minutes dragged on. Adrienne felt like she couldn't breathe, the silence almost unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards above them made her jump. The Wraith were so close, she could hear them, just on the other side of the door. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps began to fade. The soldiers were moving away, leaving the building. Adrienne let out a slow, quiet breath. "We're safe, for now," she whispered. Theo's hand rested on her shoulder, a silent confirmation that they had made it through yet another close call. But Adrienne knew this wasn't over. The Wraith would come back. They always did. But they had made it this far. And they weren't giving up. Adrienne's muscles ached from the hours of tension and stillness. The Wraith soldiers had moved on. But the silence inside the small storage room was deafening. The air was thick with dust, and every breath felt like it was being held in suspense, waiting for something to break it. But for now, they were safe. Theo was the first to speak. "We can't stay here long. The Wraith will eventually realize we're not in the main part of the base." Adrienne nodded. She could feel the weight of his words pressing on her. She was tired, but she knew better than to rest too long. They had to keep moving. The moment the soldiers returned, they'd be trapped again. "Let's wait for nightfall," Adrienne suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "It'll be easier to sneak out in the dark." Theo glanced out the narrow slit in the wall. "We don't have that long. The longer we wait, the more time the Wraith have to organize a full search. If we stay here too long, they'll start blocking off escape routes." Adrienne's mind raced. Theo was right. They couldn't afford to wait too long. But where could they go? The base was old, abandoned, and the Wraith had already scored most of it. They needed a place where they could regroup and plan their next move. "There's a tunnel system beneath this place," she said suddenly, remembering something from their earlier scans of the area. "I saw signs of it when we were approaching. If we can find the entrance, we can hide there. It might be our only chance." Theo's eyes lit up with interest. "How do you know about it?" Adrienne explained quickly. "I studied the old military maps from before the war. This base was designed to be a last-ditch defense point, and the tunnels were built for evacuations and supplies. We can use them to move around unseen." Theo hesitated. But if the Wraith are using this base as their base of operations, they might know about the tunnels too. Adrienne understood his concern. The Wraith were thorough, and they had probably mapped the entire area. But they had no other choice. They couldn't risk staying in the building for too long, and they couldn't fight their way out either. It was their best shot. "We'll have to move fast and be careful," she said, her voice firm. "We'll stay low, avoid the main paths, and get to the tunnel entrance before the Wraith can lock it down." Theo sighed but nodded. "All right, let's do it." As nightfall descended over the base, the shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped. Adrienne's breath formed small clouds in the air as she and Theo crept out of their hiding spot. The base was eerily quiet, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only living things left on the planet. The darkened sky above gave them some cover, but they didn't dare to move too quickly. They stuck to the edges of the base, moving from building to building, staying in the shadows. The mechanical limbs of Adrienne's exosuit made little noise, but her heart pounded with every step she took. Theo kept his eyes scanning the surroundings, his hand never straying too far from the weapon at his side. "We're close," he muttered, nodding toward a set of rusted doors at the back of the base. "That's the maintenance entrance." Adrienne glanced at the doors. They looked like they hadn't been used in years, but that could be exactly what they needed, something the Karaith might have overlooked. They approached cautiously, taking care not to make any noise. Adrian's breath came out in shallow gasps, but she pushed through it. They couldn't stop now. They had to keep going. Theo reached for the door, his fingers brushing the cold metal. He paused, listening for any sounds of movement. When he heard nothing, he slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open with a protest, sending a shiver down Adrian's spine. She held her breath as the door opened wider. Inside, the dim light revealed a set of stairs that led down into darkness. "This is it," Adrienne said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Theo nodded, pushing the door all the way open. "Let's go." They descended into the dark, the only sound the soft scrape of their boots against the stone steps. The air in the tunnel was cooler and damp, but it smelled stale, like it hadn't been used in years. Adrienne's heart hammered in her chest as they moved deeper into the tunnel, the faint light from their small flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The tunnel twisted and turned, winding through the dark underground maze. They moved quickly, but carefully, staying close to the walls and listening for any sounds of pursuit. Adrienne kept her mind focused on the path ahead, blocking out the pain in her legs and the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. "We're almost there," Theo whispered, his voice tense with anticipation. Adrienne nodded. She could feel it too. They were getting closer to whatever lay ahead. Whatever it was, it had to be better than staying out in the open where the Karaith could find them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the tunnel. The walls opened up into a small, hidden chamber. A set of heavy metal doors marked the entrance to the next part of the base. "This should take us out to the old supply depot," Adrienne said, a hint of relief in her voice. "From there, we can get our bearings." Theo approached the door cautiously. "You sure this is safe?" "I'm sure," Adrienne replied, her voice steady. "No one should be down here." The Karaith didn't think to check the lower levels. Theo didn't hesitate. He turned the handle, and the door creaked open slowly. They stepped inside, moving cautiously into the hidden room. As they made their way deeper into the chamber, the lights flickered on, revealing a small control room filled with old equipment. Adrienne's eyes scanned the area. The air was thick with dust, but there was something comforting about the silence. For a moment, it felt like they were finally safe. But Adrienne knew better. This wasn't over. The Karaith were still out there, and they still had a long way to go. Adrienne's hands shook slightly as she adjusted the worn control panel in front of her. The small room, filled with ancient tech and dim lights, felt like both a blessing and a curse. The air was stale, the equipment was outdated, but it was a place of safety for now. Theo paced nervously behind her, his boots clicking against the floor. "We can't stay here forever. The Karaith are going to search every inch of this place eventually." Adrienne didn't look up. She was focused on the task at hand, her fingers moving quickly over the dusty buttons and switches. The base's old security system was still partially functional, and if she could just get a few things working, they might have a chance to make a real escape. "We don't need forever," she muttered under her breath. "We just need enough time to get to the main comm center." Theo stopped pacing and turned to her, his face tight with concern. "You're talking about hacking into their systems, aren't you? You can't be serious." Adrienne didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed a few more buttons, her mind racing. She knew what Theo was thinking. It was risky, ridiculously risky, but it was their only shot. If she could access the Karaith's communication channels, they might be able to send out a distress signal to other survivors or allies. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. "Look, I know it's dangerous," she said finally, turning to face him. "But if we don't do something soon, they'll find us, and it'll all be over." Theo ran a hand through his hair, his gaze dark with worry. "You're right, but what if we can't get to the comms? What if the Karaith catch us first?" Adrienne felt the weight of his words, but she couldn't afford to doubt now. She had already come too far, and Theo had risked everything to stay by her side. They couldn't give up, not when they were this close. "We won't get caught," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I know this base. I can get us in and out before they even know what happened." Theo's expression softened. "I trust you, Adrienne. Just be careful." Adrienne gave him a quick nod. "Always." The air inside the control room was thick with tension as Adrienne and Theo prepared to move again. They had a plan, and they couldn't waste any more time. The comm center was located a few floors above, and it was heavily guarded, but Adrienne had seen enough of the base's layout to know there were back entrances, maintenance hatches, and ventilation shafts they could use to avoid detection. The two of them moved through the dimly lit hallways, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Adrienne kept her movements slow and steady, making sure she didn't draw attention. The walls around them were marked with old scorch marks, reminders of the fierce battles fought here years ago. She could almost feel the ghosts of the past haunting the halls. Theo was close behind her, his face tense but determined. His hand rested on his weapon, but there was no sign of the usual eagerness for conflict. They both knew that confrontation with the Wraith would be their last option. They reached a set of maintenance doors near the back of the base, where a small stairwell led them up to the comm center. The hall was quiet, the occasional flicker of overhead lights their only company. Adrienne pushed open the door to the stairwell, motioning for Theo to follow. As they ascended, Adrienne's mind raced. She had to get to the communications terminal without triggering any alarms. The Wraith had been too careful to let anything slip, but Adrienne had a few tricks up her sleeve. She had spent years studying enemy technology, finding weak points in their systems, and learning how to use them against them. They reached the top of the stairwell without incident, and Adrienne paused before the entrance to the comm center. The door was a heavy metal blast door, secured by a security panel. Adrienne moved quickly, her fingers dancing over the panel as she hacked into the system, bypassing security measures and deactivating the alarms. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside. Inside, the room was vast and cold, filled with rows of old communication equipment. The hum of machines filled the air, and Adrienne could feel the weight of the task ahead. She moved quickly to the central console, her mind focused. She had to make this work. Theo stood watch, keeping an eye on the door while Adrienne worked. Every second felt like an eternity as she connected to the Wraith's comm system. Her fingers flew across the controls, bypassing firewalls and encryption systems with ease. The tech may have been outdated, but it was still formidable. And then she found it, their communication relay. With a few more commands, she had connected to the system, and a signal started to transmit. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A distress signal, encrypted and camouflage, broadcasting to a nearby safe zone. The message was simple: survivor location, coordinates, immediate assistance needed. Adrienne took a breath, her heart pounding. She had done it, but she didn't have much time. The Wraith would detect the anomaly soon. "Let's move," she whispered to Theo. Just as they turned to leave, an alarm blared, echoing through the comm center. Red lights flashed, and the door behind them slammed shut, locking them inside. The Wraith had found them. "Go, go," Adrienne shouted, grabbing Theo's arm and pulling him toward the back exit. They ran, the sound of boots pounding behind them, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. They didn't have much time, but they weren't done yet. Adrienne's mind raced. There had to be a way out. They had come this far. They couldn't give up now. Together, they fought their way to the exit, knowing that the Wraith might not let them go easily. But in the end, it wasn't about survival alone. It was about hope. The signal was out. Help was on the way. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Adrienne allowed herself to believe it.